Did you know that it is not always beneficial for you to stretch your hip flexors and your hamstring muscles? To find out more, stay tuned. I'm Jamie, a Hatha yoga and meditation teacher, and my mission is to help you explore, understand, get to know your own bodies so that you're able to jump on your mat with confidence and adapt your practice to fit your best needs. Now, if you find this video useful, please do hit the like button below. To stretch or not to stretch the hip flexors and hamstring muscles? Well, this really depends on your own personal anatomy, whether you have an anterior or a posterior pelvic tilt. So let me go into that. What is an anterior pelvic tilt? Well, this is when your hips rotate forwards and your booty sticks out. I'm totally exaggerating right now, but it's just so you get the picture. The weight will go into the balls of my feet, my chest will stick out, and you'll get this exaggerated curve in your back. This feels really horrible on the lower back right now. Now, people who are hypermobile often hold this posture because they tend to lock the knees, which will naturally take you into this sort of posture. A posterior pelvic tilt is when your hips rotate backwards and your bum tucks in. You get this sort of flat back here. The weight is now in your heels and your shoulders tend to round forwards to compensate. And here you'll feel main discomfort in your thoracic spine, so your middle upper back region, just from holding this bad posture. You'll find that people that spend a lot of time sitting down in front of their desks might have this posture. Good posture is somewhere in between. We do naturally have a mild anterior pelvic tilt, so there is a natural curve in the spine. The spine isn't completely straight, but we're not exaggerating the movement forwards or backwards. We're somewhere in between. So what happens to the hips and the hamstrings in an anterior pelvic tilt? Well, remember, the anterior pelvic tilt, hips rotate forwards, booty sticking out. What happens here is that your hamstrings feel tight because your hips are rotating forwards and thus overstretching them. So your hamstrings might feel tight, but in reality, they're only feeling tight because they're being overstretched. If you were to stretch your hamstrings with an anterior pelvic tilt, then this would only allow your pelvis to rotate further into an anterior pelvic tilt, worsening your alignment. So you really don't want to be stretching your hamstrings in this case. Instead, you want to work on stretching your hip flexors and strengthening your hamstrings to correct the posture like this. So when it comes to a posterior pelvic tilt, what is happening to the hips and the hamstrings? Well, the opposite. So remember, posterior pelvic tilt, hips rotate forwards, bum tucks in like this. So in this case, the pelvis is tilting backwards and stretching the hip flexors. So your hip flexors might feel taut here. But actually, if you were to stretch your hip flexors, this would only allow your hips to rotate further into a posterior pelvic tilt, worsening your alignment. So in this case, you want to be strengthening your hip flexors and stretching your hamstrings, your calves, your Achilles heel to correct your alignment. Now, how do you work out if you have an anterior or a posterior pelvic tilt? Well, it's easy. Just stand in front of a mirror. Perhaps you lift your top up and just check the posture of your pelvis. Actively try to rotate your hips forwards. And if you find that there's no room for movement here, it's probably because you already have an anterior pelvic tilt. And if you actively try to do the opposite, to go into a posterior pelvic tilt, rotating the hips backwards, if nothing happens, again, that likely means that you have a posterior pelvic tilt. Now, for those of you that are somewhere in between, if you don't have that exaggerated anterior or posterior pelvic tilt, and you spend a lot of time sitting down at a desk, then you will likely benefit from stretching your hip flexors and your hamstring muscles. When you sit down for extended periods of time, what happens is that your hip flexor muscles shorten and your glutes and your hamstrings weaken. So it will generally feel quite good to stretch out the hips and the hamstrings. But what I want you to take away from today's video is that there is no black or white. Whether you stretch or you don't stretch the hip flexors and the hamstrings really comes down to your own personal anatomy, your own specific body type, which is why my aim is to help you understand and get to know your own body so that you can adapt your practice to be able to maintain a healthy home yoga practice. So please do comment down below. Let me know if you think you have either one of these two pelvic positionings, and know that you can reach me at my Facebook group, Yoga for Back Care and Better Posture. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to my channel, and I will see you next time.